So let me introduce Clifford. Firstly, it's my pleasure to welcome him to the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research Seminar Series. And his topic is Policing Dreams. And Clifford, the formal bio of Clifford is that he holds professorships at the universities of Griffith, Cape Town and Montreal. He's a visiting professorial fellow at the University of New South Wales. His research is focused on the emergence of new harms or harmscapes. And in this regard, he co-leads the Evolving Securities Initiative, which is a global network of scholars and security practitioners exploring responses to new harmscapes. So his recent books include Criminology and the Anthropocene with Holly, Security in the Anthropocene with Harrington, Criminology and Climate with Holly and Phelan. But aside from this, Clifford is also a global pioneer in terms of advancing our ways of thinking about security policing and criminology more broadly. He has always been a big thinker, way ahead of his time. So for instance, he was one of the first scholars to write about private security, currently a burgeoning topic of interest within criminology, where scholars are only now writing about some of the issues Clifford was writing about over 40 years ago. And Clifford has long been advocating for the decriminalization of criminology and was again writing about the development of policing budgets rather than simply police budgets over 30 years ago, an idea that the defund the police movement has now taken up. He and others developed a new analytical and methodological tool called nodal governance, which has developed into a theory in its own right, adopted and used by criminologists, but also those from a variety of other disciplines and in both global North and South contexts. Furthermore, Clifford has also been pushing the boundaries of the criminological discipline through his engagement with the Anthropocene, particularly, as mentioned, the books he's written with others on security in the Anthropocene and criminology in the Anthropocene. And so what better time to have him talk to us about the future of policing in this age of pandemics, climate change, and ultimately new harms and harmscapes. So thank you again very much, Clifford, for agreeing to talk to us. I'm going to be running the PowerPoint presentation. So if anything goes wrong, it's completely on me. But let me just share the presentation and then I'll hand over to you, Clifford.
Okay, great. Okay, hello everyone. It's excellent being here. So let me begin with my thanking the organizers for inviting me here. And it's both a pleasure and a genuine honor. And a very big thanks to Julie Berg for her role in organizing this event and her generous introduction. And a very heartfelt thank you to you, Julie, for our ongoing productive research collaborations. I really appreciate that we can do this together. So let me begin by taking inspiration from the late David Wallace, who began a commencement address in Kenton College in Ohio in 2005 with a little story. Here's his story. There are these two fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Good morning, boys. How's the water?" The two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" Let me begin by outlining what you can expect from me for the next 20 minutes or so. I'm going to begin by explicating the term dreams in the title of my remarks by introducing the idea of grand designs. Next, I will introduce two influential grand designs that you all are very familiar with, that have and continue to shape policing. Third, I will change tack. I will do so not by looking at top-down drivers, which I'll have done with the grand designs, but at bottom-up drivers of policing and policing forms, namely the harmscapes that are shaping contemporary policing. Harmscapes, by the way, is a term that Julie and I have been using. Fourth, I will explore the impact of these bottom-up drivers by introducing a program of research that I'm involved in that is exploring how contemporary harmscapes are reshaping policing. And finally, I'll conclude with some speculative thoughts arising from this work about the future of policing. I'd like to begin with a caveat before I get going. My focus on policing will be within the Anglosphere. And I want to just stress that this is just a tiny sliver of a much larger policing canvas. So you just understand I'm talking about a tiny sliver. Right, so let me get off my starting blocks and get going. Escobar, in his books Designed for the Pluriverse, introduces the idea of grand designs and notes that what makes them so influential is that once they become widely accepted as normative goals, as shared dreams, they become embedded in subtexts that surround us and define us. Once this happens, these grand designs become our water. As our water, they become so taken for granted that we barely notice them. To shift metaphors, these grand designs become part of our woodwork. And as our woodwork, they constitute our ways of being. One way in which they do this is by defining our sensibilities. These sensibilities enable us and the institutions and organizations of which we are all a part to be who we are and to do what we do. Importantly, in shaping our doings, our actions, as Michel Foucault, Dorothy Smith, James Boyd White, and many others have noted, these sensibilities constitute what is thinkable for us and what is unthinkable. As a consequence, they constitute what is doable and what isn't doable. In short, to use Escobar's words, grand designs deeply structure people's realities and their everyday lives. So let me now turn to policing. The policing we have had and the policing we now have been profoundly shaped by our grand designs. Indeed, we might think about policing and its architectures as having been sculptured by these designs. As everyone knows, as everyone here today will know, there have been two principal grand designs that, as our water, have been busily at work in the background, shaping and forming our policing. The first and the oldest of these grand designs has been a view of policing and governance more broadly as something that governments should do, that states should do. This grand design is principally be associated with the thinking of the English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes. And he presented his thinking in the mid-1600s in his book, Leviathan. And the cover of this is now on your screen. In this book, Hobbes argued that governing societies should be primarily the business of governments. To do otherwise, Hobbes argued, would ultimately lead to endemic conflicts, conflict that he characterized as a war of all against all. We all know this. Hobbes's core idea was ultimately that there needs to be a single overarching political authority who governs. We need a Leviathan, an entity that Abram Boss depicts on the cover of his book as a benign giant overseeing a country. Put starkly, there should be one strong central authority, one principal auspice of governance that represents all, that represents everyone, rather than a multiplicity of private governments, to use Stuart Macaulay's term. One of the indicators of how successful this grand design has been is that the term private governments comes across as an oxymoron, as a conceptual impossibility. The central idea of Hobbes's grand vision was nicely captured by Frederick William Maitland, a 19th century historian of English law, when he wrote of multiple private pieces being swallowed up by a single encompassing public piece. This public piece, as we know, is often thought about as the Queen's piece or the King's piece, as the Leviathan's piece. This grand design has been exceptionally influential in shaping policing. And as a consequence, by the middle of the 20th century, policing was regarded as something that only state governments should be able to authorize. And in addition, as something that only police, as government officials of the government, should do. Put starkly, only police should do policing. To use other words, police should monopolize policing. This was the ruling grand design shaping policing until about the middle of the 20th century. Then, quite suddenly, it seemed a shift in grand design occurred that knocked poor Maitland's trajectory off the tracks it was on. To borrow language from a 2010 book by Michael J. Fox, a funny thing happened on the way to the future of policing. This funny thing involved the emergence of a Hayeken-inspired tweaking of Hobbes's grand design. A tweaking came to be termed neoliberalism. While conceptually, it makes sense, I think, to see this as a tweaking of Hobbes rather than an overturning, as it is often viewed. This shift of thinking has had enormous consequences, both generally for government, governance, and for policing. Looked at through the narrow lens of policing, what this tweaking argued was that while states should most certainly continue to authorize policing, the actual business of policing did not need to be performed exclusively by government agents, by a civil service. More specifically, what this policing slither of this grand design argued was that policing not only could be done by non-policing agents, but that it should be done by these agents. Policing should not be monopolized. Policing should be done by others. In particular, this slither of neoliberalism argued that policing could and should be done by private actors. David Osborne and Ted Gabler, in a book entitled Reinventing Government, used a nautical metaphor to capture this idea. They argue that while government needed to be steered by while governance needed to be steered by government, governance should not be the only ones doing the rowing. What was being argued, to use language that is common today, was that policing would be better performed if it was undertaken through private-public partnerships than if it was undertaken by the police alone. Although police-only policing has in fact always been just a dream that has never ever been actually realized, these developments effectively knocked this only police should do it policing dream off its pedestal. As this happened, police embraced what policing actually had been all along, namely plural and polycentric. By now, there was no longer any embarrassment about this. Policing rather quickly became, as there was no longer any embarrassment, policing rather quickly became very explicitly plural, polycentric, and nodal. To use a term that Julie and I have been using recently, became increasingly whole of society in nature. As this happened, polycentric or nodal policing has shifted from being bad policing to being good policing, from being a bad thing that we should work against to being a good thing that we should support. And as good policing, polycentric policing moved from something that was discouraged to something that was now strongly encouraged. And as this happened, police have significantly, indeed rather drastically, changed their stance about what good policing is all about. So goodbye, police monopoly of policing. Hello, partnership policing. Rather than seeking to realize a monopoly of policing, police have now embraced plural policing as a model of good policing. As a result, and again, surprisingly quickly, plural policing has become the new normal across a whole pile of areas, and a new normal for police. David Bailey and I, in reflecting on these developments some time ago, dubbed this new normal the new structure of policing. As this happened, to use Jean-Paul Brodeux's phrase, a policing web, what Adam Crawford has conceived as a mixed economy of policing, has become the order of the day. This is the policing we have. And this is more or less where things stand today. One of the interesting things about this is that today, really for the first time, our dreams of policing and our grand designs for policing, pretty much actually mirror the reality of policing. What we think policing should be is more or less what policing is. We think policing should be plural, and in fact it is. And police are very happy about this. They say, we've always known that we can't do this alone, we need help from others, and so on. Recently, so what we argue about today is not whether policing should be police only, or police and others, or lots of others. What we argue about today is the architecture, the contours of a mixed economy of policing. We argue about what this mixed economy should look like, what its contours should be. And this brings us to a point that, that Julie has made earlier. What this argument so a recent example of this, about these arguments about contours of plural policing, are the arguments that are being advanced under the sign, defund the police. What this argument and the political movement that has emerged in support of it seeks to have happen is for monies that are presently allocated to the police be reallocated, at least in part, to other players within the policing web. Incidentally, as Julie mentioned, this defund the police idea is far from new. Indeed, the idea of this move, that idea that this movement embraces, is essentially the idea that we should move from police budgets to policing budgets. This idea, as many will know here, was the basis of one of the policy proposals endorsed by the Patent Commission report on the policing of Northern Ireland, released in 1999. So, this is where I'm going to stop talking about grand designs for a moment. And so now my change of tack that I mentioned at the outset. A change of tack that will lead me from grand designs as shapers of policing to what we might think of, following Bruno Latour's lead, as the social material context in which policing occurs. The mix of people and things as a context within which policing occurs. So the question I'm going to now turn to with this in mind is, what might policing look like a decade from now? I will make this change of tack from grand designs to social material contexts by outlining a research project that I'm involved in. What this research project is asking really is, so what can we expect? What might be in store for policing? What might policing look like in, say, 10 years, or perhaps as soon as 4 years from now? Or actually, if we're beginning to see things from the pandemic, what is policing beginning to look like right now? So one of the ways of thinking about this question is to look for lines of flight that are coming visible, to look at what lines, what developments are we seeing happening, as a way of identifying what kind of shifts in policing might be starting to emerge. Looked at this way, we start to try and understand what the future of policing would be, not by just looking ahead, but by looking at the present and saying, what can we see now? What can we find now that suggests lines of flight, things that might be happening? At present, that is receiving much attention right now from policing scholars, because we're in the midst of a pandemic and people are asking, what does this pandemic mean? So one of the lines of flight that is being identified on the basis of these inquiries, both within policing and more generally, can be summarized by the statement that you see all around us: the state is back. The other side of this coin is the suggestion that the neoliberal grand design might be losing its grip on our dreaming. This is leading to claims like, the neoliberal era is dead, a line that I read very recently in an article in the New Yorker. Of course, what one concludes about lines of flight that will shape the future depends on which present reality, which now we are looking at. A present that I have been looking at with my colleague and friend Benoit Dupont from the University of Montreal is suggesting a somewhat different line of flight to this one. The present we have been looking at is the present of climate change and more generally the Anthropocene, of which the climate change is a part, along with the present of cyberspace, artificial intelligences that James Lovelock has dubbed a Novocene. And I'm going to use the word Novocene just as a simple way of talking about this reality of cyberspace and the intelligences that are now part of it with humans. So the Anthropocene and the Novocene. What Benoit and I have been doing is exploring the harmscapes of the Anthropocene and the Novocene and the responses of security professionals broadly understood in response to them. A very empirical, radically empirical project. It's not a critical piece of study in the sense we're not asking what should the responses be or what would the appropriate responses be. We're simply asking what is happening and what are the responses. And we're talking about security professionals in a very broad sense. Those people who are dealing with the harms that undermine our safety and our security. And we're asking simply, what are they thinking? How are they sense-making? How are they making this all up? What are they doing in response? Who are they working with? And we've been doing this, again, as part of our sort of radical empirical approach, one case study at a time, with each case study focused on one particular harmscape, one particular set of harms that are clustered together. To date, and we're about a third to half of the way through our project, and we hope it might continue after our money for this first phase is used up. To date, we have explored responses to a recent drought that it was thought might see Cape Town's taps literally run dry. There might be no water in the taps in Cape Town, an extraordinary drought. We've been looking at cyber attacks on the international banking industry. We've been looking at hurricanes that have been impacted Houston in Texas. We've been looking at cyber attacks on the shipping industry. We've been looking at extreme weather and cyber attacks, impacts on critical infrastructure in Queensland, Australia. And we've been looking at cyber attacks against local governments in North America. So this is where we've been looking. And we have a few others that we have in mind. So I've now been talking for about 20 minutes. So let me begin drawing my remarks to a close by identifying two lines of flight across these case studies that we suspect are going to be particularly significant in shaping the future of policing. So this is what we've been looking for. We've been looking very specifically and done quite a few papers and reports on our specific case studies. And often I say the people we're working with have been from other areas, geography, climate science, this and that. So we're doing specific reports. but we've also started to look at cross-cutting themes. Just hang on. And so this is our sort of most recent thing. We haven't written on this yet. So the first line of sight we're suggesting, and at first it doesn't seem very novel, but it is that policing is going far from the neoliberalism being dead. Policing is going to be even more plural than it has ever been. It's going to be becoming abundantly clear that policing assemblages are emerging, and novel policing assemblages at that, in responses to these harmscapes that we are exploring. And these assemblages are drawing on capacities and knowledge that are very specific to these harmscapes. So policing is becoming what we may think of as very harmscape specific, very harm specific. And I'll come back to this in a moment. It's specific to the harms and the challenges to security and safety that these harms are producing. This is leading to the emergence of novel security professionals. People who never thought about themselves as dealing particularly with safety and security in those terms now are engaged in that. And it's leading to novel assemblages. And actually, police as a particular agent, and they are moving between assemblages. We see it a bit in the policing of the pandemic. Police organizations have sort of been decoupled somewhat from criminal justice and recoupled to the health system. And they are policing alongside public health professionals. And so this is the point I'm making now. New assemblages, but also new policing partnerships or novel policing partnerships are emerging. So for us, the field of policing is sort of exploding in its forms. New breeds, as it were, emerging. Saw this and seen it in each of our case studies. Each of our case studies has, we've seen this happening. In short, partnership policing is not only alive and well, but our evidence is suggesting that partnerships are blossoming more than ever. Isn't something I want to deal with here, but to go back to Stuart Hawley's notion of private governments, this is something we're going to be looking at, the authorities that are authorizing these forms of policing. I just flag it. So policing is becoming radically polycentric. By this I mean that the monocentric forms of policing that seem to us becoming almost anachronistic, a thing of the past. People and organizations do not police alone. And who they police with is very varied and changing enormously. Just a few decades ago, it seemed sensible, indeed obvious, to equate police with policing. That is to think of policing as what police do. This seemed to be the most sensible way to think about yesterday's policing. Today, this is clearly, for us, with the evidence we're seeing, no longer true. Tomorrow's thinking about policing, thinking about policing in this way will simply be thought of as just plain silly. Doing so will give rise to questions like, why would you think like that? Furthermore, if Benmar and I are right in detecting the lines of flight we have, what we think is likely to emerge is a proliferation, not just of policing actors, but as I've hinted already, policing assemblages, different ways of bringing policing actors together. As this happens, the criminal justice assemblage that has been so front and center, that today is so dominant, will, we suspect, emerge as just one policing assemblage among many. And part of this, and I see Orca van Dijk is in the audience, he and I and Gary Corden are talking about in relation to COVID, police will not be seen simply as the front end of the criminal justice system. They will be seen as part of multiple systems, something that private security always has been seen like. So I'm just sort of kind of teasing out themes that we are beginning to see and beginning to explore as we start taking our cross-cutting view. For Benoit and I, a significant feature of partnerships that we see emerging and the assemblages being created is that they are not being driven by grand designs. These are not coming about because of normative agendas. These are not coming about because this is the way we want to see the world. And this, we think, is theoretically significant. Rather, they are being driven by pragmatic responses to what we think of as the realities of 21st century harmscapes and the new worlds, the worlds of cyberspace, the worlds of the Anthropocene that are emerging. And this might take us back, because if you go back to the beginnings of policing, you can see harmscape changes in the 1800s, in the 1700s, were driving some of the changes with urbanization taking place. Something that we think is worth writing about and thinking about. We haven't done so yet. Another theoretically significant development for us is the fact that both the Anthropocene and the Novocene are not social harmscapes. They are social material harmscapes. Things in them are just as important as humans, and humans as things that are emerging as a result of activities. These harmscapes and the policing forms are emerging as a result of activities of both human and non-human actors, to use Bruno Latour's term. Now, looking at the time, to bring my remarks finally to a close, let me turn to the second line of flight that we see as shaping the future of policing, namely the emergence of novel understandings of policing, different ways of making sense of policing, different ways of making sense of responding to harmscapes. With respect to this second line, our key findings, and they won't be a surprise to anyone here, across our case studies, is the emergence of resilience as what we're thinking of as a new conceptual technology, a new way of making sense of things. And this conceptual technology is reframing policing in significant ways. Perhaps the first feature of this framing is to note that resilience, and again I want to stress, as a conceptual technology, operates to cement and to emphasize a future-focused policing. Policing is becoming more than ever a process to creating a better tomorrow. In words I used some time ago, it's not repairing the past, it's repairing the future. And so this better tomorrow is becoming a central objective of the policing we're seeing emerging. A related feature of this resilience framing is an acceptance that we live today in what Pat O'Malley has termed an age of uncertainty. Contemporary harmscapes are full of surprises. That's what that means. Surprise, as opposed to same old, is what we're finding. This endemic uncertainty is making prevention increasingly difficult to accomplish, as conventional forms of prevention are premised on the emergence of anticipated tomorrows, along with the capacity to predict and anticipate these tomorrows. The actuarial tables of insurance provide a very good example of this attempt to, we know what tomorrow is be like, we can anticipate it, we can predict it. It's a probability, but we know what it'll be like. In the context of radical uncertainty, preparedness remains essential. In fact, more essential than ever. But just what preparedness means and can mean is changing significantly. Across our case studies, preparedness was understood as requiring adaptability and agility as a core feature of policing, of a core feature of contemporary policing. And as a consequence, policing is becoming much less about applying established templates and more about quickly discovering and then implementing novel responses and creating novel assemblages that may be fairly short term to respond to this problem. This is changing the nature of the playbooks that security professionals have been using to prepare for future events. Associated with this is another feature of the resilience framing that we are observing across our case studies, namely a focus on restoration, but not the focus we have been associated with thinking about as restoration. This focus is not the restoration of existing processes, not bringing back the old processes, but rather the discovery and establishment of novel processes, often at a moment's notice, that will enable the restoration of functionalities, of crucial functionalities, in the face of disruptions of existing processes. Existing processes are being disrupted, and this means functionalities are being disrupted. The focus is not on the processes, but on the functionalities. In language that is proving to be central to the resilience framing, the focus is on bouncing forward rather than simply bouncing back. Bouncing back focuses on re-establishing processes. In contrast, bouncing forward focuses on developing novel processes to bring back crucial functionalities. To extend this analysis a little further, what our case studies are revealing is that cutting across both the lines of fight I have identified is the safety and security of what we're thinking of as crucial and critical flows. Flows have moved to the center of our policing stage. Flows that the harmscapes of the Anthropocene and the Novocene are now routinely disrupting. Central to these new policing endeavors is the avoidance of collapses, to use Jared Diamond's terminology. That is, the avoidance of collapse of critical social material functionalities that are crucial to the survival of individuals, communities, and where disruptions to processes are severe enough, the collapse of whole societies. Although the notion of collapse may have seemed exaggerated, hyperbolic, just a year ago, the massive disruption caused to supply chains by the COVID-19 pandemic and the strains experienced by health systems, even in the richest countries, have shown us just how quickly a stable system can deteriorate into a state of extreme fragility. The flows that have emerged as crucial across our case studies are flows of water, keeping those going, flows of electrons, most critical, as we've seen the importance of the internet in the pandemic, flows of food, we've seen this also crucially, flows of information, financial flows, and of course, flows of a whole variety of material goods. In the language of security that is emerging, each of these flows is being associated with a context-specific conception of security. Food security, energy security, information security, and so on. No longer safety and security as an omnibus term. Whose security? Where's the security? What needs to be secured? If the findings of our case studies are anything to go by, then we should expect the future of policing both to be radically plural, in a way I think that we now find it difficult to imagine, and to be focused on the security and safety of critical social material flows. That brings me to the end. Thanks for your attention.